On board the International Space Station, the crews, they were up and got right into preparing for Dragon's arrival. NASA's Anne McLean and Nicole Ayers, who you've heard at times on the big communications loop talking to all parties. They are in the station's cupola using specialized software to track Dragon's approach and making sure it stays in the expected zones with that orbital nighttime currently enveloping the station and the Dragon spacecraft. They're keeping a close eye, and of course from the space station perspective, and we'll see it as we receive video communication, that strobing effect, that strobe light on the front, and that forward nose cone of the SpaceX Dragon to help illuminate its path and help keep track. Earlier, we also received that as the Dragon spacecraft makes its way towards Waypoint 1 about 22 minutes from now, that the teams on the ground were looking to bypass this milestone, but will again do a go, no-go poll, make sure everything looks exactly as it should before allowing that bypass of the spacecraft, and then its maneuver up and over top of the International Space Station, and then proceeding onto Waypoint 2. And a great graphic of the International Space Station, and just below it, the Dragon spacecraft is, again, they are making their journey across the Pacific Ocean, traveling over 26,000 kilometers an hour and 420 plus kilometers above the Earth's surface. We've been talking about that methodical approach for the Dragon spacecraft that started immediately, or 45 minutes or so immediately after launch yesterday morning, in which they would execute a series of burns from the phase burn to the boost burn, co-elliptic, or close burn, transfer, and co-elliptic burn. Those 5 burns allow for the stair-stepping of Dragon to climb up in altitude, but also to close the gap, the distance between the International Space Station and the spacecraft itself. And that is what's led us up to this morning. The approach initiation burn started just shortly after the start of this broadcast, in which Dragon, in integrated operations with SpaceX and NASA working together with Axiom Space, all monitoring closely as Dragon Grace continues its way towards the orbiting lab, and looking to turn a crew, the Expedition 73 crew of 7, into a total of 11, a full house above the orbiting lab. Now inside 20 minutes to the Waypoint 1 arrival. And about 10 minutes or so, the teams here inside Houston, as well as and SpaceX in Hawthorne, California, will continue to monitor and do the go, no-go for Waypoint 1. And if everything is on track, they'll continue to proceed through Waypoint 1 onto Waypoint 2. And Waypoint 2 has them right on the doorstep of the International Space Station, about 20 meters out when they arrive to that waypoint, a little more than 65 feet away. If you are just joining us, we are continuing to follow along the progress of Axiom Mission 4 and the 4 astronauts aboard: Commander Peggy Whitson, pilot Shubanshu Shukla, and mission specialists Sławomir Uznański-Wiśniewski and Tibor Kapu. The 4th private astronaut mission, and the first since January 2024. to make its way towards the International Space Station, in which they will spend approximately 2 weeks doing research investigations and outreach activities, expanding commercial space. We are tracking a docking time of approximately 5:18 a.m. Central Time, 6:18 a.m. Eastern. The next key milestone that we are keeping an eye on is the arrival of the spacecraft to Waypoint 1. And to gain perspective, Waypoint 1 will be about 220 meters away between the Dragon spacecraft and the International Space Station. And that's the second checkpoint. They have already reached Waypoint 0 to begin this process. Waypoint 0, Waypoint 1, and then on to Waypoint 2, which we mentioned is about 20 meters away. Great views there from the International Space Station, looking at the Dragon Grace spacecraft, that strobe light illuminating its path, as well as the port and starboard side lights. The red and green that you see on your screen is both the International Space Station and Dragon Grace in an orbital nighttime period. They're actually crossing over the Pacific Ocean, about to cross over the equator, and then eventually make its way over the west coast of North America. We'll start to see the spacecraft and the International Space Station once again become illuminated with an orbital sunrise. In a few more moments, that'll occur as they continue their journey over the Pacific Ocean. And for the Dragon spacecraft, approaching Waypoint 1, now about 15 minutes from that point. And we'll continue to bring those great views as you see that slow and steady progress of the Dragon vehicle as it continues to track down the orbiting laboratory. And on your screen, you see the speed and altitude, where it is over the Earth in current relation. But on that far right-hand side, that's the thruster firings. And you just see those illuminate every so often as Dragon continues to fine-tune its path towards the International Space Station. And this mission since launch approaching now 1 day, 3 hours or 3.5 hours of time. That's the time you see in the middle there, the T plus. 1 day, 3 hours, 28 minutes and 40 plus seconds. As the crew aboard, anxious and ready to join the Expedition 73 crew aboard the International Space Station. And as we take a look at those crew members and introduce them to you, that'll welcome the Axiom Mission 4 team. They're led by Commander Takuya Onishi of JAXA, the Japan Aerospace Exploration Agency, who just recently celebrated about 2 weeks ago his 200 days in space. Anne McLean, NASA flight engineer, will be there as well. Her and Nicole Ayers, the two NASA astronauts monitoring Dragon's approach to the International Space Station. For McLean, celebrating 300 days in space last week. And for Nicole Ayers, this past Monday, celebrated 100 days in microgravity. They're also joined by NASA astronaut Johnny Kim, flight engineer, and Roscosmos cosmonauts Kirill Peskov. For Peskov, he would also celebrate 100 days this past Monday as a part of the Crew at 10 team. and then Roscosmos cosmonauts Sergei Ryzhikov and Alexei Zubritsky also joining the cadre of 7 astronauts and cosmonauts aboard the International Space Station. We mentioned earlier, this is the 4th private astronaut mission to the International Space Station, and the first since January of 2024, since Axiom Mission 3, from the Axiom Mission 1 now through Axiom Mission 4. The International Space Station will have welcomed 14 different private astronaut crew members representing 111 different nations, and showcasing how these private astronaut missions truly expand access to the space station for more nations, people, and opportunities. And we talked about this crew, in approximately their 2 weeks on board the orbiting laboratory, will participate in around 60 research investigations representing 31 countries, with more than 24 of those experiments sponsored by the ISS National Lab. In about 2 minutes, we'll monitor the loops and keep an ear out for the go, no-go poll on the ground for teams that'll be monitoring Dragon's approach to Waypoint 1. And that waypoint will be reached in a little less than a dozen minutes, 12 minutes from now. This is Mission Control Houston, as we are continuing to monitor the Dragon Grace spacecraft and Axiom Mission 4, the private astronaut mission, as it continues its approach to the International Space Station. They have moved past Waypoint 0 and are now on its way to Waypoint 1, the second of 3 checkpoints or 3 gates for this journey for the spacecraft to the orbiting laboratory. We just received an update that the new anticipated docking time, approximately 5:30 a.m. Central Time, 6:30 a.m. Eastern, as the Dragon spacecraft and the International Space Station teams here on the ground, both in Hawthorne, California for SpaceX and inside of NASA's Mission Control Houston and the International Space Station Flight Control Room, continuing to work together in communication and relay those updated data and projections and trajectory and all the information needed. So again, that docking time has been updated to now approximately 5:30 a.m. Central, 6:30 a.m. Eastern. And the flight control teams here in Houston and listening in on the loops on overall communications have just pulled go for Dragon's approach to Waypoint 1. And they will reach that milestone Waypoint 1 in about 9 minutes from now. This waypoint will have the spacecraft 220 meters away from the International Space Station, a little more than 656 feet. And once it reaches that docking access, an additional go-no-go poll will be created, in which the teams will then poll for the arrival of the spacecraft to Waypoint 2. And given the go there, Dragon Grace will move to within 20 meters and little more than 65 feet from the orbiting laboratory. And earlier we also had communications that if everything goes to plan and Dragon continues to remain on its trajectory, that they would bypass Waypoint 1 and go straight from 0 to Waypoint 2. But once it arrives to Waypoint 1, this will be the point in the spacecraft's journey in which we will be on what we call the docking axis, which will essentially mean that it is directly in front of the docking port that it'll connect itself to. The crew are right now heading to the space-facing port on the International Space Station, node to zenith of the Harmony module. That zenith meaning it is the side of the space station facing space. So its journey brings it from underneath the International Space Station, Dragon Grace, to swinging up and over top of it, and then arriving at that docking axis en route to Waypoint 2. We'll continue to bring views of the International Space Station and Dragon Grace spacecraft as we receive them, as the two continuing their chase to connect up as they're now making their way towards the western coast of North America in an orbital nighttime configuration. And we've seen views of the Dragon spacecraft in that orbital nighttime with the strobe lights shining bright. Once it gets closer, it'll actually illuminate the International Space Station and allow for greater views of the docking port itself that it'll connect to. And again, that node 2 is zenith port of the Harmony module of the space station. And that anticipated docking time that has now recently been updated to 5:30 a.m. Central, 6:30 a.m. Eastern. Teams on the ground have pulled go for our Dragon's approach to Waypoint 1. And that arrival to that checkpoint will be a little more than 5 minutes from now. The crew inside Dragon Grace Axiom Mission 4. They are in their launch and entry suits and ready to continue their journey towards the International Space Station. And there you see it, the view from the orbiting laboratory, looking at Dragon Grace. As you see that strobe light we were just mentioning, as it gets closer, will illuminate the side of the orbiting laboratory, as well as the port and starboard lights, the red and green. Crew in their launch and entry suits, providing that extra layer of protection and pressure, and that happens, are in them during these dynamic phases of flight. Now inside 5 minutes from Waypoint 1. When Dragon docks to the International Space Station, there will be 5 spacecraft connected to the orbital outpost, and we'll bring the crew up to 11 crew members, and the overall total of the International Space Station to 288 visitors since 1998. They will join the Dragon Endurance spacecraft that brought up Crew 10 back in March. They will also join with the Soyuz MS-27 spacecraft that brought NASA astronaut Johnny Kim to the International Space Station in early April. And then 2 cargo craft, Progress cargo craft from Roscosmos also aboard the station, and then eventually the Dragon Grace spacecraft. As we get now views inside of Dragon Grace, And looking over the shoulders of Commander Peggy Whitson and pilot Shubanshu Shukla of Isro. And you see them adjusting their monitors as the approach continues on for Dragon. And then a great view in the middle of the screen there of the path Dragon is taking. Last time we saw inside, it was more towards the left-hand side of the screen, in which Dragon now flying up and over top of the International Space Station. And now we get great views from Dragon Grace, and there's the strobe light. You can see it ever so faintly illuminating the International Space Station as it continues.
Station Houston on the big loop. Dragon is transmitting docking camera video. Please confirm video and data updating in Dragon Docking Monitor. Also, we have a new docking time of 10:30.
Copies. We are seeing data on the Dragon Docking Monitor, and we copy 10:30 for the new docking time.
Houston copies.
Great communications there on the big loop between the teams in Houston and SpaceX, talking to Dragon Grace and the confirmations of the updated docking time. You heard the words 10:30. That's 10:30 Zulu, which Central Time is 5:30, as we had mentioned, 5:30 a.m. Central, 6:30 a.m. Eastern, as we return to that exciting view from Dragon looking up at the International Space Station. You can ever so faintly see the solar arrays coming into view, and that strobe light illuminating the radiators, which are right along that central portion and angling upward. The International Space Station and the Dragon spacecraft now approaching the west coast of North America, right around the Seattle area, that border between the United States and Canada, as we are approaching 1 minute away from Waypoint 1, the second checkpoint and second series of waypoints for the spacecraft to reach to. The teams have already pulled go, but we will listen for the call outs for that Waypoint 1 arrival.
Dragon SpaceX on the big loop, approach 1 and soft capture ring extension will begin shortly. Dragon will continue approach to Waypoint 2. As a reminder, manual impulsive retreat recovery is not permitted.
And Dragon copies all.
And there you heard communications on the big loop about that soft capture ring, and that is the initial contact that will occur between the Dragon spacecraft and the International Space Station, a soft capture, with that soft capture ring then retracting and the 12 hooks that will drive and connect and form a hard mate between the spacecraft and the International Space Station. From there, power communications will then be connected up, and astronaut Nicole Ayers will make her way into the pressurized mating adapter and get ready for hatch opening procedures, which will require bringing the vestibule, the space between the two hatches, between the International Space Station and Dragon Grace, together. And there we see the orbital sunrise making its way over top of the International Space Station as they continue their pursuit of each other, now angling over at North America. And there in the center screen, if you look at the topmost, the Dragon now perfectly aligned over top of the International Space Station, now looking down at that Node 2 Zenith port, and a great view just off the bottom portion there. That is the Dragon Endurance spacecraft that it'll be just alongside of. So Dragon has reached Waypoint 0, and on initial comms earlier that the teams on the ground, once reaching Waypoint 1, have been allowed to bypass that waypoint and now move on to Waypoint 2, which will be in about 9 minutes from now, and targeting docking in about 14.5 minutes from there. Go, no-go polls for docking in about 7 minutes as the teams on the ground continuing to monitor Dragon's progress. And once they arrive to Waypoint 2, there will be a pause, make sure everything is lined up just perfectly before that final approach and docking. This is Mission Control Houston as Dragon Grace and the spacecraft carrying Axiom Mission 4 and their 4 astronauts continuing their approach to the International Space Station. They have just made their way past Waypoint 1, which had them at 220 meters away from the space-facing port of the International Space Station's Harmony module. And now on the path to reach Waypoint 2, teams on the ground have concurred or agreed that they will take a brief pause at Waypoint 2, which is 20 meters away, to make sure everything is aligned precisely. And there you see the view from Dragon and that newly illuminated International Space Station as the 2 craft navigating its way over North America, coming into an orbital sunrise and daytime period.
Station on the big loop. Dragon attitude is still as expected, and station is ready for docking.
Houston copies. At Waypoint 2, Dragon will briefly pause to align for docking, then automatically resume approach.
Station copies.
Commentator Rob.
You just heard great communications on the big loop from Station and Dragon, as well as the teams in Houston and in Hawthorne for SpaceX and NASA, as the Dragon Grace spacecraft continuing its approach to the International Space Station, carrying Axiom Mission 4 Commander Peggy Whitson, pilot Shubanshu Shukla of Isro, Sławosz Uznański-Wiśniewski of ESA,
Dragon
and
SpaceX.
Tibor.
Soft capture ring extension complete. Dragon will continue through Waypoint 2 without a hold.
Second copies, no hold at Waypoint 2, and good rating extension.
Great communications there. They were anticipating a brief hold to make sure everything aligns, but Dragon Grace continuing on what has been so far so good. A great rendezvous with the International Space Station. They will proceed to continue past Waypoint 2. And you also heard in the communications with NASA astronaut Nicole Ayers, the station ready for docking. and a great view of the SpaceX Dragon Grace spacecraft making its glacial approach to the International Space Station, and the view from the space station looking up as it approaches the space-facing or Node 2 Zenith port of the Harmony module. We are about 4 minutes away from the Waypoint 2 arrival, which again they are expecting to move right past through without a hold. That is at the 20-meter mark, and proceed right on into docking, soft capture, and then soft capture ring retraction and hooks to drive. And that capture, about
Dragon
8 minutes
SpaceX
and 47.
on the big loop, ground is go for approach 2, and approach is now allowed. Reminder, ensure that visors are closed prior to Dragon's departure from the waypoint. Once Dragon is inside the crew hands-off point, retreat and breakout are not permitted.
Dragon copies, and we have visors down, and we are go for docking as well. And copy on the approach. Inside 2, stop.
SpaceX copies, visors down, SpaceX crew is go for docking.
All great communications there as the communications from the ground up to the SpaceX Dragon Grace spacecraft, as visors are down on the 4 astronauts inside as they continue their approach to the International Space Station, now nearly 7 minutes away from that initial contact. Dragon and the International Space Station now making its way over the northernmost territories of North America and Canada, and heading towards the Atlantic Ocean, as we are now 7.5 minutes away from the approximate docking time, as Dragon will move smoothly past Waypoint 2, about 20 meters away. And continuing its fine-tuning and approach, you see little plumes coming off the spacecraft. Again, those are those thruster firings continuing to inch and adjust the spacecraft towards the orbiting laboratory. Dragon continuing to get bigger and bigger from the viewpoint of the International Space Station, as Waypoint 2 about 90 seconds away, and there it'll be just a mere 20 meters away. And there the spacecraft will focus on aligning its docking system with the docking adapter, and then fly in to make the initial contact and give us what we will call that soft capture, or the soft capture ring will retract. And then the hooks will drive to form the hard mate. And that capture, or that initial contact, coming in about 6 minutes from now.
Yes, they have it. I can press them. They switched out.
Approaching 30 seconds away from Waypoint 2 arrival, in which the Dragon spacecraft will be about 20 meters away, just called out 30 meters, so continuing its close in to the International Space Station. Dragon Grace now 25 meters away. Dragon has now reached Waypoint 2, 20 meters away from the International Space Station, and will continue its approach to the International Space Station. And there you can see a great view of that zenith port, that space-facing port of the International Space Station's Harmony module. As the Dragon spacecraft right now sitting at Waypoint 2, just 20 meters away.
Houston station for step 4 in block Bravo. Dragon attitude is as expected.
Houston copies. Station Houston on the big loop. Dragon is on final approach and is go for docking. Monitor per steps 5 and 6 and 1.102.
Station copies, monitoring per steps 5 and 6.
And there you heard it. The final steps relayed up to the crew for final approach and docking have been given as we continue to see Dragon Grace spacecraft close the gap between them and the International Space Station. Now, just before the spacecraft reaches the international docking adapter for that soft capture, you'll hear the call out CHOP, or crew hands off point, which Dragon will continue its journey and make that initial connection, that soft capture, in those final few moments.
SpaceX Dragon, 10 meters.
10 meters.
Inside 10 meters, a little less now than 30 feet away, is all that separates Dragon Grace from the International Space Station.
Five meters.
5 meters.
Meters, chop.
2
Houston
meters.
station, 2 meters, chop.
We have CHOP.
1 meter.
1 meter. Dragon contact and soft capture complete.
Roger, copy.
Dragon Grace and the Axiom Mission 4 crew have arrived to the International Space Station at 5:31 a.m. Central Time over the North Atlantic as the two orbiting around the Earth, connecting with the soft capture ring, and now we'll begin the ring retraction to bring the two vehicles closer together, and then the 12 hooks, the two sets of 6, will drive to form a hard nut. And there you heard there, the soft capture ring is retracting, and then we'll do so until sensors are indicating it's time for those hooks to drive in place and give us a hard capture and firmly secure Dragon to station. And again, Axiom Mission 4 and its commander Peggy Whitson, pilot Shubanshu Shukla of Isro, and mission specialist Sławosz Uznański-Wiśniewski and Tibor Kapu of ESA and Hunor have arrived to the International Space Station with contact at 5:31 a.m. Central, 6:31 a.m. Eastern, as the two were orbiting over the North Atlantic. The soft capture ring, that initial contact between Dragon Grace and the International Space Station, continuing to retract, and we'll await for the calls that the sensors read that it will be time for those 12 hooks on the Dragon to then begin driving and connecting itself to form a hard mate to the International Space Station.
Ring retraction complete. Docking sequence is holding for MCS reconfiguration.
This is Mission Control Houston, as you are seeing a live view of the recently connected Dragon Grace spacecraft with the Axiom Mission 4 astronauts and Peggy Whitson, Shubanshu Shukla, Sławosz Uznański-Wiśniewski, and Tibor Kapu arrive to the International Space Station, soft capture and contact at 5:31 a.m. Central Time, 6:31 a.m. Eastern, as the two were orbiting above the North Atlantic. And right now, the two mated with that soft capture, the soft capture ring retracting to pull the spacecraft closer to the International Space Station. And once given the go, the ring or the hooks around the Dragon nose cone will drive and connect to form a hard mate. Teams on the ground in both Houston.
Station Houston on the big loop. MCS configured, proceeding with hook driving.
Station copies.
And a great call there. That's the next step in this docking procedure is the driving of the hooks, the 12 hooks surrounding the nose cone or the nose of the Dragon spacecraft. And we'll monitor those. They'll drive in 2 sets of 6. The first set of 6 right now, they're traveling, and we'll continue to follow along as the docking process continues on. And then after that first set of 6, the second set will drive and connect Dragon to form a hard mate to the International Space Station. And once the docking is complete, NASA astronauts Anne McClain and Nicole Ayers, who have been monitoring from the International Space Station from the cupola of the Dragon's arrival, it'll be Ayers that'll begin the hatch opening or hatch operations. And that'll start by opening up the main hatch on the Node 2 Zenith section of the Harmony module. That's what you see Dragon connected to. And what's separating that module and the Dragon spacecraft is that and continuing to monitor that first set of 6 hooks forming that hard mate. And once the full set of 12, Ayers will continue the docking procedures with the leak checks and then begin making its way into the pressurized mating adapter. That's what you see between the Harmony module and the Dragon spacecraft, and access into there to then what we begin pressurizing the vestibule, that small compartment between the 2 hatches. And that vestibule has been exposed to the vacuum of space prior to Dragon Grace's arrival. So the next step is to carefully reintroduce that air and pressure inside so it matches both that of the station and the Dragon spacecraft. And we just received confirmation that the first set of 6 hooks have driven and closed, and we'll now begin the second set of 6 to continue that hard mate between the Dragon spacecraft and the International Space Station. If you are just joining us, this is Mission Control Houston, where Axiom Mission 4 aboard the Dragon Grace spacecraft have connected to the International Space Station at 5:31 a.m. Central Time, currently in the process from soft capture to the hard mate to the orbiting laboratory. First set of 6 hooks have closed, and now monitoring that second set of 6, 12 in total, to form that hard mate.
Dragon, SpaceX on the big loop, hard capture complete.
Dragon copies, hard capture complete.
And we just heard confirmation there. All 12 hooks have closed, and that is a hard mate to the Dragon Grace spacecraft and the International Space Station, completing from soft capture to that hard mate. And these So the soft capture ring retraction in progress, and then it'll be on to establishing umbilical connections between the spacecraft and the International Space Station. That'll allow for the transfer of communications and power through those umbilicals. So we're Dragon, you see that upper portion that's mostly black against the vacuum of space, but that's the solar arrays to provide Dragon power. Once those umbilicals are connected, that power will then be provided by the International Space Station, and communications will have that hardline connection with the umbilicals as well. And once those umbilicals have been connected, that'll complete the docking process, and that's when NASA astronauts Anne McClain and Nicole Ayers, namely Ayers, will jump into action and begin the leak checks and hatch opening procedures. And that'll allow the pressurization of the vestibule, the space between the Dragon spacecraft and the International Space Station, to be brought to pressure equal to that of what is inside station and inside the Dragon spacecraft, about 14 psi, what you experience here on Earth as sea level. And then from there, the hatch operations will continue. And the Axiom Mission 4 team will make its way on board the International Space Station with welcome remarks soon to follow. Soft capture ring has now been stowed away, and the umbilicals are in motion again to connect Dragon Grace and the International Space Station, providing that communications, that direct line of communications and power.
Dragon SpaceX on the big loop, docking sequence complete. Ground will be enabling hardline power and comm connections shortly. You are go to DOF suits per procedure 4.012 and begin post-docking cabin configuration per 4.400 in parallel.
Dragon copies, docking complete, 4.012 and 4.400 are in work. And Grace is happy to be on Harmony.
And Grace Station, we are excited to welcome you. Peggy, Shug, Suave, and Tibor, we cannot wait to open the hatch and give you guys a hug. We'll see you soon.
Looking forward to it.
And Axiom 4 from Houston, welcome aboard the International Space Station. It's an honor to have you join our outpost of international cooperation and exploration.
We are honored to be here. Thank you.
Very exciting moment for all those aboard. This is Mission Control Houston, and an exciting moment for all of us here at NASA's Johnson Space Center and the International Space Station Flight Control Rooms, as well as the teams in Axiom Space, also in Houston, and in Hawthorne, California, and SpaceX as Axiom Mission 4, the private astronaut mission with Peggy Whitson, who you just heard talking on the big loop, the single line of communications between all four parties, sharing her excitement as she returns to the International Space Station, bringing up first-time flyers and pilot Shubanshu Shukla of Isro and mission specialist Sławomir Uznański-Wiśniewski of ESA and Tibor Kapu of Hunor. Contact between the two, between Dragon Grace and the International Space Station at 5:31 a.m. Central Time. And now that the hooks have connected, all 12 and umbilicals deployed, providing power and communications. Now the team inside the International Space Station, namely Nicole Ayers, is going to start beginning the hatch opening procedures. And now that we're docked, she will secure some hardware and then move right into those operations. And first we'll open the large hatch at the Node 2 Zenith, or the space-facing port side of the Harmony module. And that's what you see, similar to where that NASA logo is. That's the Harmony module that the pressurized mating adapter is jettisoning up into and connecting to the Dragon Grace spacecraft. And then from there, she'll traverse into that pressurized mating adapter and we'll begin pressurizing the vestibule, which is that small space between the hatches on Dragon and the space station. And we have talked about this has been exposed to vacuum prior to docking. And we'll need to fill that space with air to make sure that pressure is equal with the atmospheric pressures on Dragon and the International Space Station. Also putting away some hardware in the process, including the docking across. And Ayers will use a small valve on the station's hatch to slowly introduce that air into the vestibule. And flight controllers here in Houston will continue to monitor the pressure and temperature readings inside and verify that everything is A-OK and leak-free before we get ready to open up the hatches. From that capture moment, which again was 5:31 a.m. Central, 6:31 a.m. Eastern over the North Atlantic. It takes roughly about 2 hours to get everything pressurized and checked out before we open up the hatches and welcome in Axiom Mission 4 to the International Space Station.
Commentator and producer on
SpaceX Dragon on the big loop. Com check on the cabin mic. How do you...
Peggy, I have you loud and clear on the cabin mic on the big loop. Dragon, SpaceX on Dragon aground. That call on the cabin mic actually came over Dragon aground.
Thanks for the catch. We reconfigured.
This is Mission Control Houston as we continue to follow along the progress of the contact capture and beginning of hatch opening procedures as Axiom Mission 4 has arrived to the International Space Station with contact at 5:31 a.m. Central Time. The soft capture and ring have been retracted and stowed away. The 12 hooks around the nose, the bulkhead there of the Dragon SpaceX connected to the pressurized mating adapter have latched on to create the hard mate. The umbilicals have been extended to allow for Dragon to run on power and communication lines provided by the International Space Station. And now looking at approximately 8:35 a.m. Central Time for welcome remarks, and shortly after the Axiom Mission 4 team make their way through the hatchway and into the International Space Station. The docking procedures between the soft capture ring, the hooks, and umbilicals have been completed.
Station on the big loop. Node 2 overhead hatch is open.
Houston copies.
And a good call there down from NASA astronaut Nicole Ayers saying that she has opened up the hatch for the Node 2 Zenith way, the space-facing side of the Harmony module, to give her access to the pressurized mating adapter. And there she will cruise in to begin work on the hatch opening procedures and pressurizing
Station and
the vestibule.
Dragon. Houston on the big loop. We are troubleshooting the big loop audio comm issues from earlier, and the action we're about to take will take down big loop comm between ISS and the Axiom crew for about 5 minutes. We may require additional comm checks after.
Station copies.
Dragon copy.
Communications there on the big loop between the teams here in Houston and up to the International Space Station as they troubleshoot some communications, and the big loop that you have been hearing that have connected everyone here inside of Mission Control Houston and the International Space Station Flight Control Room, those aboard the space station and inside the SpaceX Dragon Grace spacecraft, and the teams in Hawthorne, California, those 4 parties, that's the big loop. They will troubleshoot those communications for about 5 minutes and then recheck. But you heard just prior to that NASA astronauts Anne McLean and Nicole Ayers have begun the hatch opening procedures, in which the large hatch at the Node 2 Zenith, that's the space-facing side of the Harmony module, has been opened, and that will allow for them to begin the hatch opening procedures and pressurize the vestibule, which is what, in addition to the comms checks, we will monitor, as Ayers will use a small valve on the station's hatch to slowly introduce air into the vestibule. That's the gap between the Dragon spacecraft and the International Space Station that has been exposed to vacuum. And from there, they will match the pressure, the atmosphere inside both station and Dragon. And this procedure for a hatch opening usually takes about 2 hours or so to perform leak checks and make sure every connection and everything is safe and sealed.
On the big loop. In step 2.4, the time is 10:56. The APAS equalization valve is back closed.
Houston copies. That's a good config. Expect at least 15 minutes before we continue.
Station copies.
And that communication between the International Space Station and the International Space Station Flight Control Room, and you heard the word APAS hatch. That is the hatch, again, that they will be operating and looking to open up from the space station side. But in doing so, they will need to pressurize, as we've been talking about, the vestibule, and then allow for the atmospheres to match between the Dragon Grace spacecraft and Axiom Mission 4 crew, the vestibule itself, and the International Space Station all equal throughout to allow for the parties to pass through for the hatch opening and eventual welcome remarks. The contact for Axiom Mission 4 to the International Space Station about a half an hour ago at 5:31 a.m. Central, 6:31 a.m. Eastern. And as they continue to configure the hatch opening procedures for NASA astronaut Anne McClain and Nicole Ayers, between the two of them, we'll continue to work those procedures, and we'll hear those communications throughout in anticipation of Axiom Mission 4 and Commander Peggy Whitson making her return to the International Space Station, her 5th flight, 2nd as a member of Axiom Space and the commander of Axiom Mission 4, and her previous 3 as a NASA astronaut servicing key missions to the International Space Station. And a big part of the coming up in November, 25 years of continuous operations and humans on board the orbiting laboratory. And there she will welcome also first-time flyers and pilot Shubanshu Shukla of Isro, Sławomir Uznański-Wiśniewski of ESA, and Tibor Kapu of Hunor for Shukla, Uznański-Wiśniewski, and Kapu representing India, Poland, and Hungary. This will be those nations' first time visiting the orbiting laboratory. And with that, from Axiom Mission 1 through Axiom Mission 4, the International Space Station will have welcomed 14 different private astronaut crew members representing 11 different nations, showing how private astronaut missions truly expand access to the International Space Station for more nations, people, and opportunities. And on your screen, you see the clock counting upwards at the bottom, the T+, that is 1 day, 4 hours, 28 minutes, and now
SpaceX Dragon.
Dragon SpaceX on the big loop. Dragon SpaceX ComCheck on Dragon to ground.
SpaceX Dragon from the cabin mic on Dragon to ground.
Peggy, I'm with you on Dragon to ground.
Here. Did you call for me, or did I misunderstand?
I was returning your call.
Okay, stand by for inventory.
Copy, standing by.
comm checks and communications there between the teams in Hawthorne, California and SpaceX and the SpaceX Dragon Grace spacecraft. As we heard earlier that they were troubleshooting some communications and looking to bring back on the big loop that connects the teams on the ground in SpaceX and NASA, as well as the teams in the International Space Station and the Dragon spacecraft itself.
SpaceX Dragon 4 inventory reporting on Dragon to ground.
And I'm with you on Dragon to ground. We are about to enter a LOS period for about 4 minutes, so we'll need to stand by.
communications between SpaceX and the crew aboard the SpaceX Dragon gray spacecraft, saying they are upcoming on a period of LOS, or loss of signal, that's anticipated as the International Space Station and the spacecraft orbiting around the Earth and transfer of satellite signals. Right now they are making their way over the southern Indian Ocean and about to head into a period of orbital nighttime, as we will get back views as soon as we have them. And again, the spacecraft carrying Axiom Mission 4 and the 4 private astronauts contact with the International Space Station at 5:31 a.m. Central Time, and expected to continue with hatch opening procedures as they have already driven the hooks, connected the umbilicals for power and communications, and NASA astronauts Nicole Ayers and Anne McLean working on those hatch opening procedures as we speak. And that will allow the crew to make its way from Dragon into the International Space Station, going from a crew of 7 aboard the orbiting laboratory to a crew of 11. And that'll be followed by welcome remarks at approximately 8:35 a.m. Central Time, 9:35 a.m. Eastern Time. Certainly an exciting moment for all of us here in Mission Control, but we want to check back in with our team over in Hawthorne as Axiom Mission 4 has arrived to the International Space Station.
For as many times as we have had the privilege of supporting crews headed to and from the International Space Station, I'm certain that it is an incomparable experience. Something that unless you're on board, you can't possibly understand what it really feels like. Paul, and I'm confident that you and I cannot do it justice even attempting to tell everyone joining us today about it. So instead, we have invited Axiom Space's own commander, Michael Lopez Alegria, to share from his previous experiences.
LA, MLA, or Commander, you've got a few designations, right? For those who may not know...
How you doing, Paul? Good to see you, Ronnie.
Hey, it's good to see you as well, sir. Thank you for joining us this morning.
Yeah, good to be with you.
So for those who may not know, I've got to share a few stats here just to make sure people understand who we have joining us today on the show. You've flown to space 6 times, 2 of those to Dragon, on Dragon for Axiom Space. You've got a running total of, say, 296 days, 16 hours and 15 minutes, give or take or so, in space. You've conducted 10 EVAs over the course of your career, and when you're not in space, you're helping get others at Axiom Space to space, right? As our chief astronaut. Do I have all of that right?
Sounds good. I'm not sure about the minutes and seconds, but everything else sounds right.
That's awesome. Well, we want to spend some time with you and just ask you some questions about your experiences getting to the International Space Station. Obviously, you know a thing or two about rendezvous and docking. So the first question is simply, we've just watched Dragon Grace dock to the space station. You've done this several times. What's the mindset for a crew at this point in the mission?
So as we get closer and closer, you know, we're transitioning from the phase where you're basically waiting to get to the ISS, and you're laser focused, especially the last 220 meters from what they call Waypoint 1 into docking. A lot of focus on what's being shown on the displays. We have several parameters that we're monitoring: closure rate, the what they call the corridor, et cetera. There are a few things that could cause the system to stop or retreat or even break out, which means you'd come back and try to rendezvous on another day. So that's really what's going on, at least technically, I guess, in your mind. Obviously, emotionally, it's a completely different story. You know, you've been in there, in these cases, their cases, they've been in there for, you know, almost 30 hours since launch. Not a ton to do. And so they're very eager, I'm sure, to get aboard the ISS and start working.
So for you, on your missions, say AX-1 and AX-3, what was this moment of the anticipation of the hatch opening? What was that like for you and your crew?
You know, like a lot of spaceflight, it's very busy, and you're trying to juggle a couple of different emotions. I mean, obviously, one is you've got a lot to do. They're getting out of their suits. They're putting on their flight suits to get across. They've got some reconfiguration of the onboard systems to take care of. So on that plane, you know, you're sort of focused on the task at hand. But secondarily, you're thinking, again, a lot about what it's taken to get here, what is this going to be like when I float aboard the ISS for the first time. So there's an emotional component that is also pretty strong. A lot going on.
So backing up even further, before you get to that kind of emotional moment of crossing the threshold, tell me a little bit more about the journey to get to that point. We, on this end, get to see launch, ascent, and then spacecraft separation. But after that, as you mentioned, you're kind of on your own. What are some of the hallmarks of your transit up to the station?
Yeah, as you know, Ronnie, from the time of post-orbital insertion, when the Dragon is configured for on-orbit operations, until you really start the approach initiation, you're basically playing catch-up. And I heard it very well explained by John yesterday on the broadcast during launch, that it's basically you're on the same lane as the ISS, but now you've got to catch up. And the way we catch up is by having an orbit with a lower altitude than the ISS. So we actually go around the Earth a little bit faster each time. And with each lap around the Earth, we get closer and closer. And so there's not a ton to do. Those maneuvers to adjust the orbital altitude, we call them burns. They happen, first of all, automatically. Of course, we are monitoring when they're going on. But between those things, there's not a ton to do. The Dragon is a very efficient spacecraft for what it is meant to do, which is transit to get you from the Earth to the ISS. But it's not really cut out to be an on-orbit anything, really. So you're just sort of hanging out. They'll have they will have had a sleep period while they wait to get there. But there isn't a ton to do between those maneuvers, and so it's really kind of a hurry up and wait. Again, a lot like a lot of human spaceflight, very intense activities, followed by some pretty long lulls occasionally.
And so then when do you get to go from that free-flying, like transit mode to the rendezvous and docking phase?
Yeah, so after that series of maneuvers to change the altitude, we start approach initiation. And I would say that the transition is really when the spacecraft starts pointing at the ISS. Until then, the attitude is really optimized for power and communications considerations. But when it gets beyond a certain point, it starts actually looking at the ISS, and then you start being able to pick it up in the displays through the forward-looking cameras that are on board.
L.A., you've described the moment of getting into microgravity as you've transitioned into another plane, another world, another moment. Can you share a little bit of that thought, that mindset, as you transition from, obviously, the acceleration of launch into microgravity and being in that other world? I'd love to hear your perspective on that transition.
Yeah, you know, Paul, it's interesting. I mean, it really is kind of like a parallel universe in a way. We all live our lives in 1G pretty much our entire lives. But when you make that transition, it really is a very different sensation. For the first time you feel it, you can't even believe it. I mean, it's a little bit like the zero-G airplane that we are trained in, but of course, instead of lasting 20 seconds or so, it lasts effectively forever. And so that sensation, I mean, it just brings a smile to your face when you let go of something and it just stays hovering in front of you. And it just never gets old. It's really quite remarkable.
I love it. And obviously our crew in Dragon right now is in that other plane, in that other world of microgravity, being constant. So we're walking forward. We're progressing towards this moment where the hatch will open and they are going to enter the space station. You've mentioned this already a little bit, but I'd love to just kind of unpack that some more. What is it like to just kind of float through that hatch and realize you're no longer in Dragon, you're now in the station?
Yeah, think about the experience that these guys have had. I mean, they've been training in the mock-ups that look just like the ISS, but you're obviously walking around in there, you're not floating. So now they've experienced microgravity, but in the fairly confined spaces of the spacecraft. Once the hatch is open, it's a special moment, and as a commander, you really never get to see it because generally they go in first. But you can just feel their wonder as they float across the hatch, and they are actually in that environment that on the one hand looks so familiar, but in a different way feels very different because now you're floating and not walking through it. It's a similar experience, and I remember on AX-1, when the three first-time flyers saw the Earth from the first time from the Dragon spacecraft after we got into orbit. And again, I didn't see their faces because they were glued to the windows, but I could just feel, hear, and sense how excited they are, and it's a magical feeling. And I'm looking forward to, to trying to perceive what that must be like for these three as they float aboard the ISS.
One of the things we're really looking forward to with this crew is the welcome ceremony that's going to be today at 8:35 a.m. Central. Tell us a little bit about the history or the tradition associated with welcoming a new crew on board.
Yeah, that goes back, obviously, 25 years or so when we first started having handovers aboard the ISS. But recently what we've done is added a pinning ceremony to that, and that is where Peggy, as a commander, will provide astronaut pins to the three new flyers, Shuk, Slav, and Tibor. And those pins will have a number associated with them, which is the number of orbital astronaut they are. So they will be the 634th, 35th, and 36th humans to have orbited the Earth in the history of humanity. So when you think about it, it's a pretty small number considering humans have been around quite a while. But it's pretty nice, and of course, to be greeted by the onboard crew, all 7 of them, lots of hugs, lots of different languages being spoken, and a lot of smiles.
And so then after you have this great welcome moment, sharing all of that across different cultures, different teams, how quickly do you transition then to working together on station?
Pretty quickly. You really have to hit the ground running. There are a few safety things that we go through with the ISS commander where they'll tell us some things that, of course, they have learned in the mock-ups again, but now this is for real. These are where things are located. This is what we expect you to do if this or that goes wrong. And then really it's off to work. We start transferring a lot of cargo out of the ISS. Most of that will be to support various scientific experiments that we're bringing on board. And then our lives get ruled by what we call the Optimus Viewer, which is basically a moving map of your schedule from the time you wake up to the time you go to bed. And it's pretty hectic. You've got, in this case, 14 days to get a lot of stuff done. Every detail is pre-programmed by the teams on the ground working with NASA. And we really have an effort to try to maintain that pace. Obviously, it takes a bit of time to get accustomed to floating around. Even though they've been in zero-G for over a day, they haven't been in zero-G in such a big open space. And so moving around, you've heard the term or the phrase slow is smooth and smooth is fast. They definitely will be practicing that. So there's a little bit of time for adaptation. There's quite a bit of time with the safety briefings that I mentioned. But after that, it's looking at Optimus Viewer and really getting started.
LA, you've just mentioned that schedule is full and you jump right on into it, trying to stay ahead of that red line in that Optimus map you mentioned. But I'm curious, just looking back at AX3, your previous mission, what were some of the highlights for you personally on board the space station?
We've learned a lot since AX1 and the progression through AX3, and I think one of the things we learned is that we really need to focus the commander's time on being available to the other crew members. So I would say one of the most gratifying things is giving them the time and space to sort of inhale, exhale, think about what they're doing, and take their time, because really the planners have done a great job fitting all of these activities into these 14 days, and there is enough time to do it. It doesn't do anybody good to get flustered and upset. You just go one step at a time, and then letting them have a little bit of time to look out that window, because that is a view that is spectacular and unforgettable. I think my advice to the crew would be, you have a huge responsibility. Your families, your colleagues, your space agencies, your nations are really counting on you, but at the same time, try to enjoy it. Try to really soak this in. This is generally a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. And again, it's that balance between, sort of the focused, hard nails, technical work, and trying to really absorb the emotional experience, which is obviously very unique.
Unique indeed. You just mentioned there that there's lessons to be learned that you share out with each of the crew members. And I know that you got a chance to do that with this crew ahead of their launch, I believe, in quarantine. So I'm curious if you could share some of those lessons learned with us. If you were preparing to take us up next, what would you share with us?
Well, the good news is that, Peggy has done this a time or two herself, and her crew will probably be as ready as anyone that you can imagine. So my time with this crew was pretty short and pretty informal because of A, her experience, and B, the training that, as I mentioned, has evolved since AX1 to the point that I think we have it pretty well suitcased in terms of what to train, what not to train, and how much of each. Again, my advice to them is try to absorb it, try to be as cognizant of what's going on, because it is that parallel universe, again, that's hard to get to. And the more of that you can sort of soak away in the recesses of your mind, the better, because I'm quite convinced that this crew in particular is extraordinarily well trained, and they'll have no issue getting through their timeline and all their activities that they have to do. I just want them to think about the stuff that they can do and take advantage of the amazing experience that they're having.
Commander, thank you so much. We truly could spend the next hour talking space with you. Thank you for sharing your time and your perspectives with us this morning.
You bet. It's been a pleasure. All the best.
Thank you. You too. With that, we're very excited to hand the ball back over to NASA Johnson Space Center, where we're going to get a further update on the progress on board station and our AX4 crew. Joseph?
Thank you very much, Ronnie and Paul. We appreciate it, and great interview there with Michael Lopez Alegria.
Dragon copy.
And a great update right there to bring us right back into what's been happening and all the key milestones of the hatch opening process and the docking process for Axiom and Mission 4. Its team on the Dragon Grace spacecraft, and have connected to the International Space Station. You heard that power and the connection with the umbilicals. Everything has been established. A hard mate has been created after the initial contact and soft capture connection and ring retraction. That was at 5:31 a.m. Central Time, so a little less than an hour ago. And we are still on board, as Ronnie, as you mentioned, tracking that welcome remarks and welcoming the crew formally on board the International Space Station around 8:35 a.m. Central Time. So far, everything's still being worked on in terms of those hatch opening procedures as the Dragon spacecraft has connected itself to the Node 2 Zenith port, or the space-facing port of the International Space Station, and we'll bring you back those views as soon as we have them, as we are continuing our coverage all the way up until those welcome remarks and bringing on the Axiom Mission 4 team, the fourth private astronaut mission to the orbiting laboratory. On board the International Space Station as we speak, as you heard those comms checkouts and power and communications checkouts continuing to roll on along. NASA astronauts Nicole Ayers and Anne McLean, who monitored Dragon's progress throughout the morning, from the approach initiation burn all the way through to the contact and capture. They are beginning those hatch opening procedures, and we'll continue to look at the APAS hatch and the pressurized mating adapter. That's the space that separates between the International Space Station and the Harmony module and the Dragon spacecraft itself. And in there, those series of hatches, the APAS hatch is, and the vestibule, of course, is what needs to be pressurized to allow for the APAS hatch on the International Space Station side to be opened and stowed away. And then from that angle, then it'll allow for the Dragon team to open up their side of their hatch. And once the pressure is equal between Dragon, the vestibule, and the International Space Station, that'll allow for the crew to come on board the orbiting laboratory and bring the crew, the Expedition 73 crew, which right now is a crew of 7, 7 and welcome in their guests, Axiom Mission 4, and bring up the total to 11. There you can see on your screen the International Space Station and the Dragon spacecraft together orbiting over the southeasternmost portion of Australia, and they are in an orbital nighttime period right now, and that'll stretch on for another few more moments, and we hope to have those great views of the space station and the Dragon spacecraft once the sunrise and orbital daytime has returned. And again, tracking an 8:35 a.m. Central Time welcome remark, and shortly before then, you'll see the crew, and we'll have all that coverage and views of the Axiom Mission 4 team making its way into the orbiting laboratory. And again, a great interview there with Michael Lopez Alegria, commander, former NASA astronaut and commander of Axiom 1 and Axiom 3, and the ISS, the International Space Station, ready to welcome in Peggy Whitson, a former NASA astronaut, on her 5th flight, second with Axiom as commander of Axiom 2 and now of Axiom Mission 4, and bringing in pilot Shubanshu Shukla of Isro, Sławomir Uznański-Wiśniewski of ESA, and Tibor Kapu of Hunor, each representing India, Poland, and Hungary respectively. It'll be the first time that those 3 nations have been on board the International Space Station. And that'll bring 14 different private astronaut crew members representing 11 different nations to the orbiting lab, showcasing the strength of private astronaut missions and how it expands access to the International Space Station and low Earth orbit for more nations, people, and opportunities. So we continue to follow along with the hatch opening procedures that Nicole Ayers and Anne McLean of NASA each working diligently through, and we'll continue to provide updates as they arrive. During that interview, we did hear that there was some troubleshooting that they were working on the big loop that has since been resolved. So we should hear communications on that big loop that connects both the Dragon spacecraft, the International Space Station, and the teams on the ground here inside of Mission Control Houston and the International Space Station Flight Control Room at NASA's Johnson Space Center, and well, the teams in Hawthorne, California, and the Mission Control Room at SpaceX. Currently on board the International Space Station.
Station Houston on the big loop for PMA.
Houston Station, go ahead on the big loop.
Hey, we're about to get you into your next activity, but in the meantime, would you mind setting up a video of the PMA so that we could watch the crew ingress? You can use the Node 2 Camera 1 or Camera 2.
That's in work.
Thank you.
Communications from the ground here in Mission Control Houston up to the International Space Station, that PMA, pressurized mating adapter, and that is where NASA astronaut Nicole Ayers is currently operating in the hatch opening procedures, and they're asking to set up a camera so we can get live views in and witness the Axiom Mission 4 crew as they ingress or enter the International Space Station. So we'll keep an eye out for those views coming from that pressurized mating adapter just inside the Node 2 Zenith port of the International Space Station, that space-facing port. Before those communications, I'm going to say aboard the International Space Station as we speak, the 7 members of the Expedition 73 crew, featuring Anne McLean and Nicole Ayers, who are prime characters in today's docking operations, joined by Takuya Onishi of JAXA and Kirill Peskov, alongside NASA astronaut Johnny Kim, Sergei Ryzhikov, and Alexei Zubritsky. You heard during the interview with Michael Lopez Alegria some of those key milestones and celebratory moments that he celebrated in his time as the commander of Axiom at Mission 1 and Axiom Mission 3 earlier, bringing those first-time flyers in Shubanshu Shukla, Sławomir Uznański-Wiśniewski, and Tibor Kapu into microgravity for the very first time. The International Space Station also featuring first-time flyers Nicole Ayers and Kirill Peskov, alongside with Johnny Kim and Alexei Zubritsky. For Ayers and Peskov, they recently just celebrated their 100th day in orbit this past
Station,
Monday.
you actually have both Node 2 cameras on. You guys are welcome aboard.
Fantastic. Those are great views. Thank you.
And there you see the live view that the team on board the International Space Station has just set up for us to see as we are inside the pressurized mating adapter looking into what will be the APAS hatch that will eventually be pressurized and the vestibule pressurized, pardon me, to welcome the Axiom Mission 4 crew aboard once everything is equal in pressure from SpaceX Dragon to the vestibule to the International Space Station, and the hatches on the Dragon and Space Station side are open. Everything will be on schedule to welcome in the 4-member crew. And the, again, welcome remarks tracking for approximately 8:35 a.m. Central Time, 9:35 a.m. Eastern. And you heard Michael Lopez Alegria talking about the pinning ceremony that will take place during those welcome remarks. I'm looking forward to seeing those as the team aboard the International Space Station continuing to work through their hatch opening procedures. Since launching from Launch Complex 39A and NASA's Kennedy Space Center yesterday morning at 1:31 a.m. Central, 2:31 a.m. Eastern, the Axiom Mission 4 crew above the newly named Dragon SpaceX Grace spacecraft have tracked down the International Space Station through a stair-stepping procedure of multiple burns that occurred from just moments or a few moments after launch up until the early morning hours today, to allow them to catch up to the orbiting laboratory and set up for the final approach and docking, and that contact with the orbiting laboratory at 5:31 a.m. Central Time. And from that point on, it takes about 2 hours or so to allow for the hatch opening and hard mating procedures to be complete, umbilicals to be run, power and communications to be connected. And once everything is set, that's where you'll begin to see the hatch opening procedures and lead up to those welcoming remarks. And as you're following along with us, as we continue to wait for views of the International Space Station and the Dragon spacecraft as they are in an orbital nighttime period, making their way across the Pacific Ocean and approaching the equator, almost right in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. We'll get those views back from the exterior cameras. And the astronauts on board the International Space Station continuing to configure the cameras for views inside the orbiting lab. If you are just joining us, you are watching live coverage of the docking of Axiom Mission 4 to the International Space Station, the 4th private astronaut mission to the orbiting lab and the first since January of 2024. Docking has occurred, and that was exactly an hour ago, 5:31 a.m. Central, 6:31 a.m. Eastern. And now with Axiom Mission 4 attached to the International Space Station, docking and leak checks and hatch procedures and opening procedures continuing to move along. The crew aboard the SpaceX Dragon Grace spacecraft going through their procedures, as well as the 7 members of the Expedition 73 crew who are in the middle of their workday, and namely NASA astronaut Nicole Ayers and Anne McLean, who oversaw today's approach monitoring from the cupola of the International Space Station, that window to the world that you see so many wonderful views from. And Nicole Ayers currently working in the space-facing hatch of the Harmony module, where on the other side of the APAS hatch and vestibule is the Dragon SpaceX spacecraft. Airs will use a small valve on that station's hatch to slowly introduce air into the vestibule. That's the space between the Dragon spacecraft and the International Space Station. That area has been exposed to vacuum of space, so that needs to be brought up to 1 atmosphere, or about 14 psi, what we know here on Earth as the pressure at sea level. And the flight controllers here in Houston will continue to monitor that pressure and temperature readings inside and verify that everything is leak-free before we go ahead and open up the hatches. Just received communications from the team here inside the International Space Station Flight Control Room that the vestibule leak check has been successful and it is good. So they will continue to move forward with the hatch opening procedures. And again, you heard in the interview with Michael Lopez Alegria, slow is smooth, smooth is fast, as these teams making sure everything is sealed up and safe as they continue through hatch opening procedures.
Station Houston on the big loop. We are doing some more troubleshooting for the C2V2 audio issue, so big loop is going to be down for another 5 minutes. In the meantime, you are go to pick up in step 3.1 of 2.102, and NASA TV should be available on VME TV now.
There you heard communications radioed up to the crew aboard the International Space Station on the big loop that they are continuing with the troubleshooting of that communications as we are looking live up towards that node to Zenith hatch in the Harmony module, and you see several members of the Expedition 73 crew in and out of the field of view. That is Nicole Ayers going into the pressurized mating adapter and continuing hatch opening procedures, and she is wearing the long-sleeved navy polo, and the red polo that just flew by, that is Expedition 73 Commander Takuya Onishi. We've also seen glimpses of Anne McLean in the field of view, as well as certainly everybody aboard the International Space Station anxious and excited to welcome Axiom Mission 4 with Commander Peggy Whitson, pilot Shubanshu Shukla, mission specialist Sławomir Uznański-Wiśniewski, and the mission specialist Tibor Kapu aboard the orbiting laboratory. This is Mission Control Houston. If you are just joining us, you are following along with live coverage of the docking and soon-to-be hatch opening and welcome remarks of Axiom Mission 4 to the International Space Station. The mission began with the launch off of Launch Complex 39A and NASA's Kennedy Space Center yesterday morning at 1:31 a.m. Central, 2:31 a.m. Eastern. That took them on a journey that was a little more than a day to get them to the orbiting lab. They have since docked, and contact was at 5:31 a.m. Central Time. And after the connections made, the hooks driving to form the hard mate, umbilicals with power and communications connections all run. Now it is those hatch opening procedures and leak checks that the crew is currently working through aboard the International Space Station, while the crew aboard the
on 2 for step 3.2, seeing about 0 for the DBTT, looking for your go to continue.
We see the same. You're go to proceed.
And continued communications as Nicole Ayers once again floating into that pressurized mating adapter and continuing those hatch opening procedures to welcome Axiom at Mission 4. The target welcoming remark ceremony time, 8:35 a.m. Central. So a little more than 2 hours from now as leak checks and pressurization checks continue on before the APAS hatch and the vestibule and all procedures can be completed. And a great view of some of those procedures as Nicole Ayers, again, you can see her with that right hand turning the crank and working on that hatch to continue those procedures.
Dragon, station, this is Houston on the big loop for comm checks.
Dragon has you loud and clear. Dragon on the big loop, we have you loud and clear.
And Dragon, we read you the same.
Great communications checks there as the teams on the ground continuing to work on those communications between the International Space Station and the ground, as well as the teams here in Mission Control Houston and Dragon, as we are watching live inside of the International Space Station up into the Node 2 Zenith hatchway as NASA astronaut Nicole Ayers continuing with her hatch opening procedures. Docking of Axiom Mission 4 to the orbiting laboratory occurred about an hour and 10 minutes ago at 5:31 a.m. Central, and since then the crews for both station and inside Dragon have been going through those procedures and making sure everything is as it needs to be, including the proper leak checks and stowage from both perspectives, before continuing on with hatch opening procedures and welcoming remarks. We'll continue to provide updates, and you'll hear calls on the big loop of all four parties, NASA's Mission Control and the International Space Station Flight Control Room, SpaceX in Hawthorne, California, and the teams and the Expedition 73 crew aboard the International Space Station and Axiom Mission 4 aboard the Dragon and Grace
Dragon, Houston
spacecraft.
On the big loop. Stand by for hardline audio config.
Dragon copies.
also a part of these procedures, and once hatch opening continues to move along, the crews will install IMV ducting to help mix the air of the space station environment with the air inside of Dragon and seal up some of those lithium hydroxide cartridges that scrub the carbon dioxide inside of the Dragon spacecraft. And that was on their ride to the International Space Station. They'll also check some vent valves as we go, and maybe need a little bit more time on board, but these last final checks are crucial to make sure everything is good to go, since it will remain docked to the International Space Station for nearly 2 weeks. With the arrival of Axiom Mission 4 and the Dragon Grace spacecraft, newly named and given by Peggy Whitson, commander of Axiom Mission 4, shortly after launch yesterday morning, that now brings 5 spacecraft to the International Space Station, 2 Dragon spacecraft, a Soyuz MS-27 spacecraft, and 2 Progress vehicles, cargo vehicles, attached to the orbiting outpost. For Dragon, it is Endurance and Grace, connected to the forward and now zenith ports of the Harmony module, with 2 Progress vehicles and that Soyuz MS-27 also connected. And once the Axiom Mission 4 crew makes its way aboard station, that'll bring, since 1998, 288 visitors to the orbital outpost. Nicole Ayers, NASA astronaut, has returned to inside the pressurized mating adapter and working on the APAS hatch and hatch opening procedures as we continue to get great
Dragon
views from
Houston
inside
on the
the
big loop.
International Space Station.
Check. Hardline audio configuration complete, and we have resolved the audio issues on C2P2.
That sounds great, because we have you loud and clear.
We read you the same.
And that was a good communications checkout from the teams on the ground up to Dragon Grace on the C2V2 line, common communications for visiting vehicles, and that communications line connecting all parties. As we continue to work through hatch opening procedures, and again targeting approximately 8:35 a.m. Central Time for welcoming remarks as the International Space Station and Expedition 73 crew bring in and welcome aboard Axiom Mission 4. Both the orbiting laboratory and the newly docked SpaceX Dragon spacecraft over the northern Pacific Ocean, about to cross into the west coast of North America, right along the U.S.-Canadian border. And also around that time, we will start seeing an orbital daytime period as Dragon and the International Space Station have been orbiting in a nighttime phasing. Currently experiencing a satellite handover period, and we'll continue to bring you the live views from the International Space Station, both inside or exterior. Once communications is established, which should be here in the next few moments. Until then, you can see on this map where exactly we're talking about, where the station and Dragon orbiting over the Pacific Ocean and about to cross over North America and over the northernmost territories of Canada. As we await for those communications to return, to recap, Axiom Mission 4 has connected with the International Space Station after launching from NASA's Kennedy Space Center yesterday morning at 1:31 a.m. Central Time to connect with the space station at 5:31 a.m. Central this morning. So a little more than a day's transit, and where it would execute a sequence of burns to raise its altitude and close the distance between Dragon spacecraft, Dragon Grace, and the International Space Station through a phase burn, boost burn, close burn, transfer burn, and then eventually the co-elliptic burn, to make sure that the spacecraft is on the same pathway as the International Space Station and able to make its way up and over top of it to connect to the space-facing port of the Harmony module, the Node 2 Zenith port. As we now get views back inside of the International Space Station, that is a view from the other side. We mentioned the space-facing port that is looking up into where the hatchways will be to allow for the Axiom Mission 4 crew to pass through and be brought aboard the International Space Station. For Peggy Whitson, commander of Axiom Mission 4, her second flight as an Axiom commander after previously serving as commander of Axiom Mission 2. This is her 5th flight and return to the International Space Station, where she continues to build on an impressive career. The most experienced United States astronaut entered the mission with 675 days to her credit, and will certainly add to that record-setting total in her time aboard the orbiting laboratory, and bringing up pilot Shubanshu Shukla of Isro, Sławosz Uznański-Wiśniewski of Polsa, and Tibor Kapu of Hunor. And for Shukla, Uznański-Wiśniewski, and Kapu, representing India, Poland, and Hungary, respectively. For those nations, it'll be their first time coming to the International Space Station. Nicole Ayers. And the last one into the hatch, I believe that was Anne McLean, making her way in as they continue to work through hatch opening procedures. In the middle there, that is Expedition 73 Commander Takuya Onishi of JAXA. And then you just momentarily saw NASA astronaut Johnny Kim float in and out of view as the crew working together to continue these procedures, moving around some equipment, and to allow for the access to the APAS hatch after successful vestibule pressurization and checks. And that's the operations that Nicole Ayers is working on right now with Takuya Onishi. And Johnny Kim with camera in hand to document these procedures. And again, just on the other side of this hatchway is where the Axiom Mission 4 crew going through procedures of their own, inventory and doffing their suits that they wore on the uphill ride to their initial orbit. And after an off-duty period would put back on for those dynamic phases of flight, starting with the approach initiation burn that occurred earlier this morning. If you are just joining us, good morning from Mission Control in Houston in the International Space Station Flight Control Room as we are looking live inside of the International Space Station as NASA astronauts Nicole Ayers and Ann McLean alongside with Commander of Expedition 73 and JAXA astronaut Takuya Onishi going through a hatch opening procedures. And there you can see as the team has worked together to open up that A-pass hatch and continue on with those procedures to welcome aboard eventually the Axiom Mission 4 crew with the welcome remarks. Currently still targeting.
The big loop, the A-pass hatch is open and no condensation observed on the field.
Houston copies. Looks great. Thank you.
And a perfect call down right there, as that is the A-pass hatch that we were just mentioning that Nicole Ayers and team have opened up and radioing down the status and condition of that hatch with no condensation reported. And as Nicole Ayers continues to work on that hatch, you'll also see that hatch be covered up to give an extra level of safety to allow for the Axiom Mission 4 team to pass smoothly without having to worry about any additional hazards as they pass through the vestibule and pressurized mating adapter and eventually into the Harmony module of the International Space Station. Another step in this hatch opening procedure is the removal of the docking cross, which it looks like that is what Nicole Ayers is working on as we speak. And you sometimes catch glimpses of it on the docking procedures that was exposed to the vacuum of space to help provide targeting for visiting vehicles. But that'll be another step in this hatch opening process, again, to help clear the way for that pass-through between the Dragon SpaceX Grace spacecraft and the International Space Station. Hatch opening procedures continuing to move along for the teams aboard the International Space Station and Axiom Mission 4 as we draw closer and closer to the anticipated hatch opening and eventual welcome remarks And we thank you for tuning in and joining us this morning as we are live from the International Space Station Flight Control Room in Houston, Texas. Monitoring Nicole Ayers as she continues to work through those step-by-step procedures. As the hatchway, there you see the large square structure just off to the right-hand side of our field of view with that window in the middle was opened up.
Houston on the big loop. Just want to clarify, we want the standoff cross stowed in the standoff cross cover bag.
Station copies.
And that's the teams here on the ground assisting the astronauts on board the station with those hatch opening procedures. As again, that zenith hatchway we were just mentioning before the comms opened to the right, that allowed Nicole Ayers and team to pass through. And that docking cross that was just removed will be inserted into its own bag. And there is NASA astronaut Ann McLean to join Ayers in the hatchway and continue on with those procedures as they now look to cover up the APAS hatch, which was just opened a few moments ago, to provide an extra layer of safety and protection for astronauts passing through.
SpaceX Dragon suit drying is complete.
And Dragon, we copy on the big loop, suit drying complete.
Good insight there from the Axiom Mission 4 perspective of their procedures that they are currently going through in anticipation of hatch opening, and welcome remarks as they make their way into the International Space Station after connecting and docking to the International Space Station about an hour and a half ago, 5:31 a.m. Central, 6:31 a.m. Eastern. They went through their procedures, inventory, and stowage, and the doffing of their suits that they wore from launch yesterday morning from Cape Canaveral, Florida, and NASA's Kennedy Space Center, and then during the dynamic portions of operations, and are now settling into their flight suits that they will bring in and wear as they cruise into the International Space Station. And that's the view we see from the orbiting laboratory, is NASA astronaut Ann McLean and Nicole Ayers working through their procedures for hatch opening. The APAS hatch is open after successful vestibule pressurization and checks. They are now covering up that APAS hatch.
SpaceX Dragon in step 5 of 2.102. We're waiting your go for hatch open.
Dragon, SpaceX copies on the big loop. You are standing by for hatch opening. We are waiting for hardline connections to be complete. I'll call back with a go.
Okay, thanks. Sorry to rush you.
And there you heard Axiom Mission 4 Commander Peggy Whitson radioing out to the team at SpaceX. They are awaiting the go for hatch opening. I'd imagine the crew aboard the Dragon Gray spacecraft anxious and excited to float into the International Space Station for the very first time. And you just saw that orange ductwork or hose-like piece of equipment that Ann McLean and Nicole Ayers were just operating with. That's a part of helping mix the air between the International Space Station and the Dragon spacecraft. They'll continue to check some vent valves as well, so it just might be a little bit more time before we welcome the crew on board. But these final checks, again, critical to making sure that everything is good and sealed tight with no leaks and no issues, as Dragon Grace will be docked to the International Space Station for approximately the next 2 weeks.
Houston, SpaceX, station is ready for Dragon hatch equalization.
Houston, copy. Stand by.
Another step in those hatch opening procedures is Nicole Ayers just radioed down for the SpaceX Dragon hatch pressurization and equalization. As you see the pop of flash bulbs aboard the International Space Station being documented, and plenty of smiles from the Expedition 73 crew as we draw closer and closer to hatch opening and welcoming Axiom Mission 4 aboard the orbital outpost. Meanwhile, here on the ground inside NASA's Mission Control, the International Space Station Flight Control Room, anticipation also building up as the room starting to fill with NASA leadership, as well as the Athena flight team continuing to work through the hatch opening procedures. Flight Director Allison Bollinger closely monitoring every step of the way as Nicole Ayers continuing to work through each checkpoint on her list. That's what you saw on the little tablet that she was referring to, making sure every step is covered as she has now floated back into the pressurized mating adapter across the APAS hatch.
Station Houston on the big loop. We're still working some ground config actions before we're ready for equalization. In the meantime, can we get confirmation that the standoff cross went into the standoff cross bag? We were unable to tell from the video.
It was in there when you guys called. Thanks.
Copy, thanks.
Hearing communications from teams on the ground as they continue to work through hatch opening procedures and making sure all pressurization and leak checks are good and everything equal between the Dragon spacecraft and the International Space Station before the hatches can be formally opened on both sides. You can see into this hatchway the space-facing port, or into the space-facing side of the Harmony module aboard the International Space Station and the International Docking Adapter that welcomed the connection of Axiom Mission 4 at 5:31 a.m. Central Time earlier this morning. And since then, the crews aboard both the Dragon Gray spacecraft and International Space Station have been diligently working and continue to monitor the progress of that hatch opening, with teams on the ground also following suit.
Station Dragon Houston on the big loop. Stand by for equalization. Expected to take 1 minute.
Station copies 1 minute. Dragon copies 1 minute.
Great communications there from all teams here at NASA's Johnson Space Center and International Space Station Mission Control Room, teams in the SpaceX in Hawthorne, California, and everyone aboard the Dragon SpaceX Grace in Axiom Mission 4 and the International Space Station as we continue to march towards the hatch opening to welcome Axiom Mission 4 aboard the orbiting laboratory.
Dragon SpaceX on the big loop, you are go for hatch opening per the decal, followed by the remaining actions in procedure 4.400, section 6.
Dragon copies. Go for hatch open and remainder of steps in 4.400.
We are go for hatch opening is what you have just heard. And if you are just now joining us, you are tuned into live coverage of the arrival of Axiom Mission 4, the International Space Station.
And SpaceX Dragon hatch is coming open.
SpaceX copies.
Expedition 73 crew anxiously awaiting as we just received the go for hatch opening to welcome Axiom Mission 4 into the International Space Station. There you see Ann McLean in the foreground working on the tablet, alongside with Johnny Kim on the far right-hand side, NASA astronaut, and then Roscosmos cosmonaut Kirill Peskov next to him, with Alexei Zubritsky and Sergei Ryzhikov, also of Roscosmos in that mix. And right there in the middle, almost standing, if you will, from our perspective, is Expedition 73 Commander and JAXA astronaut Takuya Onishi. From this view, they are looking up.
Dragon, hatch is open at 12:14, and we're requesting the go for the LIO change.
Copy 12:14 Zulu hatch opening time, and you are go for LIO swap.
And there you heard that the hatch is open and confirmed at 7:14 a.m. Central Time, as the hatches are open between SpaceX Dragon Grace spacecraft and the International Space Station. Again, 7:14 a.m. Central, 8:14 a.m. Eastern. And you heard also the swaps of the LIO canisters. That's the lithium hydroxide cartridges that scrubbed carbon dioxide inside of the Dragon spacecraft on the ride to the International Space Station. Also, Nicole Ayers out of view, but if from this perspective, looking up, she is operating with the Axiom Mission 4 team to help refresh the air and cycle air between the two craft as they continue a few more procedures before floating across and into the orbiting laboratory for the first time.
Dragon SpaceX on the big loop for LIO cartridge.
Go ahead for LIO cartridge.
Just looking for clarification on your next action there. We're tracking LIO cartridge sealing per 2.102 step 6.5.
Oh, okay. And in my procedure, I had put instructions on the decal for section. For section 4 of the instructions on the decal.
And copy that, Peggy. We'll defer to the instructions in 2.102.
Okay, that's where we are.
You just heard communications between Axiom Mission 4 Commander Peggy Whitson and the teams on the ground as they were talking about the swapping of the lithium hydroxide cartridges as the hatch has been opened between the Dragon spacecraft and the International Space Station just a few moments ago at 7:14 a.m. Central Time. And this is a view inside the International Space Station, looking forward, if you will, as the astronauts and cosmonauts aboard are looking up. That is towards the space-facing port of the Harmony module. That's where they are in now. If you were to keep going forward, if you will, that is the forward port, which currently is occupied by Dragon Endurance from Crew 10. And a great microgravity demonstration of the camera that Alexei Zubritsky is using to help document and be a part of the welcoming committee for Axiom Mission 4 here in the next few moments.
Dragon, Houston on the big loop. Just to confirm, we want to make sure IMV duct installation is complete before we do LiO cartridge sealing.
Yes, the IMV duct installation is complete. My bad, I didn't get it reported.
Houston copies.
Now we switch views from pretty much the point of view of what the astronauts have been looking at. From what we have seen, they were looking up, and this is the shot up into that Node 2 Zenith hatchway of the Harmony module. That is Nicole Ayers, NASA astronaut, just on the other side of that APAS hatchway, working with the Axiom Mission 4 crew. You heard them talking about IMV ducting and LiO cartridges. That IMV ducting helps mix the air of the International Space Station environment with the air inside of Dragon. And then also looking to seal up some of those lithium hydroxide cartridges that are used to scrub carbon dioxide from the air in the spacecraft on their journey to the International Space Station. And that journey started yesterday morning, 1:31 a.m. Central Time, 2:31 a.m. Eastern, as they would launch on the SpaceX Dragon, newly named Grace spacecraft, on a Falcon 9 rocket from Launch Pad 39A at NASA's Kennedy Space Center, and would chase down the International Space Station earlier this morning at 5:31, nearly 2 hours ago, 5:31 a.m. Central, 6:31 a.m. Eastern, a little bit more of a day's transit.
Houston and SpaceX Dragon arrival configuration is complete.
Houston copies.
SpaceX copies.
Continuing to target a welcome ceremony or welcome remarks in the near future at 8:35 a.m. Central Time. So a little bit more than an hour from now is Axiom Mission 4 and the International Space Station continuing to work through hatch opening procedures, but getting close, you can start to see a little bit of a window of opportunity that was just on the other side of astronaut Anne McLean and Nicole Ayers there, as they are working on IMV ducting, mixing the air of the station and Dragon, and lithium hydroxide cartridges, stowage and swapping out. So Anne McLean and Nicole Ayers are starting to clear out the hatchway, and we are going to see the first views of Axiom Mission 4. Commander Peggy Whitson, the first one across the APAS hatch, receiving great big hugs from Nicole Ayers and the Expedition 73 crew. Axiom Mission 4, welcome aboard the International Space Station. Pilot Shubanshu Shukla is the next one to come across, representing Isro. It is his first space flight for Peggy Whitson, her return to the International Space Station on her 5th flight, second as a member of Axiom Space. Sławomir Wisniewski of ESA, representing the nation of Poland. And their first visit to the International Space Station is next to cross the hatchway. And warm hugs all around. And applause breaking out here inside of Mission Control Houston and International Space Station Flight Control Room, and Tibor Kapu, the fourth and final member of Axiom Mission 4, representing Hunor in the nation of Hungary, their first visit to the International Space Station as well. Great big hugs and handshakes across all members of Expedition 73 and Axiom Mission 4's Anne McLean and Nicole Ayers of NASA, along with Johnny Kim, Kirill Peskov, Sergei Ryzhikov, and Alexei Zabritsky of Roscosmos, and Takuya Onishi, commander of Expedition 73 and of JAXA, with handshakes and hugs for Peggy Whitson, Shubanshu Shukla, Sławomir Uznański-Wisniewski, and Tibor Kapu. And with their arrival to the International Space Station, that now makes 288 visitors to the orbiting laboratory. Axiom Mission 4 is now aboard the International Space Station. Commander Peggy Whitson, in her return to the orbiting laboratory, her fifth flight. 3 is a member of NASA, and her second as commander of Axiom, an Axiom Space private astronaut mission, commander of Axiom 2 and here of Axiom 4. Regaling the crew with smiles and stories. To her left, or our left from her viewpoint, to her right, Sławomir Uznański-Wisniewski of ESA, Shubanshu Shukla to her left of Isro, and Tibor Kapu on that far right-hand side of our viewpoint. The crew is safely aboard the International Space Station. Welcome again to Axiom Mission 4. And we are continuing to target a formal welcome remark from the crew and being joined by the Expedition 73 team as well. That'll be at approximately 8:35 a.m. Central Time. And from there, they will receive a safety briefing and begin their approximately 2-week mission aboard the International Space Station, in which they will participate in around 60 research investigations representing 31 countries, with more than 24 of those experiments sponsored by the ISS National Lab. And there they all are, waving back at our coverage here inside of the International Space Station Flight Control Room.
Station Houston on 2. Thanks for the wave. Great to see everybody.
Houston Station, we're happy to be here. It's so great to be here finally. It was a long quarantine.
And with the crew now in the space station, we're going to wrap up our portion of the live joint coverage from Hawthorne. It's been an honor to support Axiom Mission 4 thus far, and we wish the crew a successful time on the space station. We're, of course, also looking forward to joining AX4 again when it's time to return home.
Ronnie, from launch to docking, it has been an absolute pleasure sharing this desk with you. What has been years in the making for India, Poland, and Hungary is now well underway. Axiom Space and NASA's joint coverage will continue from here through to the welcome ceremony as Peggy, Shubanshu, Swavesh, and Tibor start their 2 weeks aboard the orbiting laboratory. Over the course of our crew's time on station, we will be producing mission updates from Axiom Space's own space station development facility in Houston, Texas. So we invite you to follow the progress of AX4 on axiomspace.com and through Axiom Space's social media channels.
So with that, on behalf of SpaceX, Axiom Space, and NASA, thank you all for tuning in to watch. While our stream on X is coming to a close, coverage of the welcome ceremony now continues on NASA Plus, axiom.space/live, and Axiom Space's social channels. With that, we'll turn it back over to you, Joseph. Have a great morning, everyone, and go AX4.
Go AX4.
Thank you very much, Paul and Ronnie, and thank you for joining us on this morning's broadcast as we continue on with our live coverage of the arrival of Axiom Mission 4 to the International Space Station, the fourth private astronaut mission to arrive to the orbital outpost and the first since January of 2024. We just saw the crew of 4, including Commander Peggy Whitson, Shubanshu Shukla, pilot of Isro, Swavesh Uznanski-Vishnevsky, and Tibor Kapu of ESA and HUNORT, respectively, crossed the hatchway and into the orbital outpost for the very first time. We're continuing to follow along as we'll wait for the formal welcoming remarks that are currently scheduled for roughly 8:35 a.m. Central Time, so a little bit more than an hour to go as the crew continues to settle in. After you heard the remarks from Peggy Whitson mentioning the long quarantine, the ride up, which took a little bit more than a day's time to do so. As the teams here in the International Space Station Flight Control Room and special guests in the viewing room at the back of your screen on hand to witness this special moment and also to be a part of a handover period as the Orbit 1 team wrapping up their day's work, which certainly was busy. That saw the multiple burns as the Dragon spacecraft named Grace would continue its transit to catch up to the International Space Station. And ultimately docking at 5:31 a.m. Central Time with that initial contact. The soft capture turned to hard capture and mating. Hatch opening procedures took about 2 hours or so to complete, with teams on both sides inside the Dragon spacecraft and the International Space Station meticulously checking for leaks and going through each procedure step by step before that moment we just had a couple moments ago at 7:14 a.m. Central Time, in which the hatch was opened and the astronauts of Axiom Mission 4 floated on through to the International Space Station. We're currently experiencing a transition in communications satellites. That's nominal and to be expected, so we will bring you back those views inside the International Space Station once we have them. But again, the teams here inside of the International Space Station Flight Control Room, Orbit 1 team wrapping up a great day's of work, or great morning's work, that saw 4 new members join the orbital outpost to bring up the attendance to now 11. This is Mission Control Houston as we continue our live coverage of the arrival and docking of Axiom Mission 4 to the International Space Station that occurred a little more than 2 hours ago as the team lifted off from NASA's Kennedy Space Center and Historic Launch Complex 39A yesterday morning at 1:31 a.m. Central Time to begin its little more than a day transit to the orbiting laboratory. And just a moment ago, the hatches were opened and welcoming in Peggy Whitson, commander of Axiom Mission 4, Shubanshu Shukla, pilot representing Isro, and the nation of India, Sławosz Uznański-Wiśniewski of ESA, and the nation of Poland, and Tibor Kapu of Hunor, as they have joined the crew aboard the International Space Station, and we will bring you those views as soon as we have them, as we are currently transitioning between communications satellites. We are targeting a formal welcome remark and ceremony coming up at 8:35 a.m. Central Time, in which the team on board the International Space Station will go through the proper voice and audio checks and visuals to perform that ceremony. Earlier in the broadcast, Axiom Commander Michael Lopez Alegria, former NASA astronaut, talked about what can be expected during that ceremony, including a pinning ceremony that Commander Peggy Whitson will perform for the newest members to go into low Earth orbit, and first-time flyers in Shukla, Uznański-Wiśniewski, and Kapu. And for those three representing India, Poland, and Hungary, they also represent the first visitors from those nations to the orbiting laboratory. You're currently seeing live views inside of the International Space Station Flight Control Room as the teams on the ground here in Houston are currently undertaking a handover period over at Orbit 1 team that had the early morning hours and monitored Dragon's approach and docking. We'll hand over to the Orbit 2 team, which will then take over for their shift of the day. Flight Director Allison Bollinger and her Athena flight team, that Orbit 1 team, undergoing the handover period as they will transition to the Orbit 2 squad, as we'll continue to follow along with live commentary and updates leading into the welcome ceremony and opening remarks on the arrival of Axiom Mission 4. Flight Director Vincent Lacourt and his Destiny flight team, the next on tap in this handover period. And there you see him in the foreground, setting up next to Allison Bollinger, Flight Director that just completed her shift, welcoming Axiom Mission 4 and her Athena flight team as they continue their handover period. And as both teams monitoring the progress and preparation for the upcoming event, the welcome remarks from Axiom Mission 4 and their formal arrival to the International Space Station. And plenty of smiles and laughter throughout the room after a successful docking that occurred about 2 hours and change from now. And that was at 5:31 a.m. Central Time, in which the Dragon Grace spacecraft, soft capture, then hard capture, connected to the International Space Station and its space-facing port on the Harmony module. Hooks connected to form the hard mate, and then over the next 2 hours would begin the procedures to pressurize the vestibule, the gap between the Dragon spacecraft and the International Space Station. That was at vacuum. They wanted to bring the atmospheric pressure equal to that of what's inside Dragon and the space station, which is relative to here on Earth, which is equal to about 14 psi, which is sea level. And once that was able to be accomplished, the APAS hatch on the space station end was open. Shortly there followed by the pressurization and opening of the Dragon hatch. And that would occur at 7:14 a.m. Central Time. And now the crew is aboard the International Space Station, settling in after a little more than a day's transit to the orbiting laboratory. And we look forward to hearing from them here shortly for welcome remarks. And again, tracking around 8:35 a.m. Central. This is Mission Control Houston as we continue our coverage of the arrival and docking and the soon-to-be welcome remarks of Axiom at Mission 4 as they have locked up and synced up with the International Space Station earlier this morning. And the crew of 4 have since floated aboard the International Space Station, bringing up its population from the Expedition 73 crew of 7 to now a total of 11. And we will hear from Commander Peggy Whitson, Pilot Shubanshu Shukla, Mission Specialist Sławomir Uznansky-Wiśniewski, and Mission Specialist Tipu Kapoor here shortly. We are continuing a handover period. The Orbit 1 team, the Athena flight led by Flight Director Allison Bollinger, handing over to Vincent McCourt, and the Destiny flight team. That'll be completed here in just a few moments. Meanwhile, the crew aboard the International Space Station continuing to get settled in and prepare for those welcoming remarks that would be a little less than an hour from now, about 50 minutes or so. The Axiom Mission 4 team that just arrived and entered the International Space Station shortly after the opening remarks will settle in and recover, and soon to get to work as they will participate in around 60 science investigations representing 31 countries, and more than 24 of those experiments sponsored by the ISS National Lab. They'll also participate in a wealth of outreach activities that they'll participate during their approximately 2-week mission. Starting with Axiom Mission 1 and now through Axiom Mission 4. The International Space Station has now welcomed 14 private astronaut crew members representing 11 different nations aboard the International Space Station, showcasing how private astronaut missions expand access to low Earth orbit, commercial space, and the space station, and bring that access for more nations, people, and opportunities. The views you are seeing now are from the external cameras on board the International Space Station, looking at the Dragon spacecraft as the vehicles now enter an orbital nighttime period. The two currently traversing across the southern Indian Ocean and about to cross the continent of Australia and make its way over into the Pacific Ocean. Formal handover underway here inside of the International Space Station Flight Control Room at NASA's Johnson Space Center. As the teams on the ground, Orbit 1 team, Allison Bollinger, Flight Director, in her Athena flight, handing over to Vincent LaCourte and the Destiny flight team, who will take over and continue to monitor the progress of the arrival of Axiom Mission 4, who are aboard the International Space Station, hatch opening between the SpaceX Dragon spacecraft named Grace, in which that hatch would open up at 7:14 a.m. Central Time, and the crew of 4, Peggy Whitson, Shubanshu Shukla, Sławosz Uznański-Wiśniewski, and Tibor Kapu, welcomed with smiles, photos, handshakes, and hugs from the 7-member Expedition 73 crew that feature NASA astronaut Anne McClain and Nicole Ayers, along with Johnny Kim, JAXA astronaut Takuya Onishi, Kirill Peskov, Sergei Ryzhikov, and Alexei Zubritsky of Roscosmos. This is Mission Control Houston, as we have just completed the handover from the Orbit 1 to Orbit 2 flight teams inside the International Space Station Flight Control Room at NASA's Johnson Space Center in Houston, Texas, as the teams continue to monitor and proceed with what will soon to be the welcome remarks from Axiom Mission 4, as they have arrived, docked, and entered the International Space Station earlier this morning. They would launch towards the International Space Station yesterday morning, starting their transit that lasted a little bit more than a day. And they would make their way starting at 1:31 a.m. Central Time with that launch. And then they would begin their transit with a sequence of burns to chase down the orbiting laboratory. And then earlier this morning, and pausing there for the final remarks from Flight Director Alison Bollinger, who oversaw today's docking of the Dragon spacecraft, aptly named Grace. And she said, graceful docking for the craft to the International Space Station in the space-facing or zenith port of the Harmony module. And that contact would occur at 5:31 a.m. Central Time earlier this morning, and then the hatchways would then take about the next 2 hours or so to make sure all leak checks and inspections were performed step by step for both the teams inside the Dragon spacecraft and Axiom Mission 4, as well as the Expedition 73 crew aboard the International Space Station. And then the hatchways would open up to allow the crew to come on board. That would occur at just after the 7 o'clock hour, at 7:14 a.m. Central Time, that the hatchway would open. And Peggy Whitson, commander of Axiom Mission 4.
I see you, Johnny, and if you were trying to call
and she would lead the charge. It'll be her return to the International Space Station after commanding Axiom Mission 2, but also her 5th overall flight, 3 previous before Axiom, as a member of the NASA Astronaut Corps, and key missions to the International Space Station.
I can do the scene and voice check now if you'd like.
From there,
check in with PAO to see if they're ready.
Producer and ACI.
now the teams here on the ground preparing for the welcoming remarks. We will see the astronauts aboard the International Space Station prepare for the proper video and audio configurations before the formal remarks can be underway, and that should occur here shortly.
Station Houston on Space Ground 2 for Johnny. Hey, we're rerouting video. Give us a couple minutes and then we'll let you know. But we're getting ready for a scene and voice check shortly.
Roger, sounds good. Thanks.
This is Mission Control Houston as we continue to prepare for the welcome remarks from Axiom Mission 4. Communications between the teams here in the International Space Station Flight Control Room, preparing to configure the appropriate cameras and audio to accomplish that welcome remark, as Axiom Mission 4 again has arrived to the International Space Station after a little more than a day's transit. This welcome ceremony will feature Commander Peggy Whitson, pilot Shubanshu Shukla, Sławosz Uznański-Wisniewski, and Tibor Kapu, all of the Axiom Mission 4 cadre, and also all members of the Expedition 73 crew. The 7 of them added to the 4 of Axiom Mission 4 to bring the population of the International Space Station to 11.
Station Houston on Space Ground 2 for Johnny. We're ready for those scene and voice checks.
Houston 10 count 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Johnny, we have a good scene, good voice. Thanks for the check. Yep, and just a friendly reminder, we're looking to start the event at 13:35.
Great, 35 after, thanks.
And Johnny, FYI, the current video that you are on is streaming live to NASA TV, so just FYI.
Roger, it's okay if I turn it off and then turn it on a few minutes at 4:35?
Sounds good. You can do that.
Good communications there between the team on the ground and the International Space Station Flight Control Room, up to NASA astronaut Johnny Kim, helping establish the good video and audio configurations for the upcoming welcome remarks that'll take place, currently scheduled for 8:35 a.m. Central Time, so a few more minutes from now, as the Expedition 73 crew will welcome formally the 4 members of Axiom Mission 4, the 4th private astronaut mission to arrive to the International Space Station. They would arrive on the SpaceX Dragon spacecraft named Grace, and that would occur earlier this morning, and then ultimately go through the hatchway and pressure checks and to ultimately allow them to cross over from the Dragon spacecraft and into the International Space Station. And that docking would occur at 5:31 a.m. Central Time for that soft capture. It would take about 2 hours or so to make sure the leaks and everything was safe to proceed. The pressurization between the International Space Station and the Dragon spacecraft were equal, and allowing for the hatchway to be opened and then welcoming in Commander of Axiom Mission 4, Peggy Whitson, Shubanshu Shukla, the pilot representing Isro in the nation of India, Sławomir Uznański-Wiśniewski of ESA and the nation of Poland, and Tibor Kapu of Hunor and the nation of Hungary. They would cross over the APAS hatch starting at 7:14 a.m. Central Time. And for Shukla, Uznański-Wiśniewski, and Kapu, representing again India, Poland, and Hungary, it is those nations' very first visits to the orbiting laboratory. So we'll continue with live coverage of the welcome remarks that will again be taking place in about 25 minutes or so, as Johnny Kim and the team were able to configure the cameras and audio appropriately. And again, that now 11-person International Space Station will come on camera and welcome in the newly arrived Axiom Mission 4 crew. This is Mission Control Houston, as the Orbit 2 team has now formally settled into their roles for the day as they continue with the welcoming procedures for the upcoming remarks from the newly arrived Axiom Mission 4. Flight Director Vincent McCourt and the Destiny flight team have now taken over, and we'll continue to work through as the Axiom Mission 4 crew begin their unpacking procedures and get to settle in aboard the International Space Station. The now orbiting lab with 11 members on board, currently in their midday meals and midday processes of their workday before transitioning into the back half of their day and then settling in for what will be a good night's sleep after a very eventful morning for us here in Houston, Texas, as well as those that followed along in the Joint Operations teams in both Axiom Space, also here in Houston, and SpaceX in Hawthorne, California. A little more than 10 minutes away from welcoming remarks of the Axiom Mission 4 team as they settle into the International Space Station after arriving earlier this morning. Docking to the International Space Station occurred at 5:31 a.m. Central Time, and then roughly 2 hours later, the hatches would open to welcome in the 4-person crew to join the Expedition 73 team. And that welcoming remarks will feature all now 11 members of the crew on board, and the first remarks from first-time flyers in Axiom Mission 4 pilot Shubanshu Shukla, Sławosz Uznansky-Wisniewski, mission specialist, and also mission specialist Tibor Kapu. And for commander of Axiom Mission 4 Peggy Wilson, a hearty welcome home to the International Space Station, and now her 5th flight of her career. For Peggy Whitson, the most experienced U.S. astronaut in history, began this mission with 675 days under her belt, 9th all-time, but will continue to add to those incredible historical numbers as the Axiom Mission 4 and its crew will proceed with an approximately 2-week mission aboard the orbiting laboratory, performing outreach events and research investigations, participating in around 60 of those investigations, representing 31 different countries. This is Mission Control Houston as we continue to monitor and anxiously count down to the welcome remarks of Axiom Mission 4 aboard the International Space Station, now inside 10 minutes to those remarks as the now 11-member crew aboard the International Space Station getting settled in and preparing before radioing back down to the teams on the ground in both Hawthorne, California, and 2 members here in Houston, Axiom Space and, of course, NASA at NASA's Johnson Space Center and the International Space Station Flight Control Room. Currently, the SpaceX Dragon Grace that brought the Axiom Mission 4 crew to the International Space Station together, connected, currently orbiting over the northern portion of the Pacific Ocean. They are in an orbital nighttime period, and we will bring you those exterior views once the station and spacecraft emerge into the orbital sunrise and orbital daytime. But until then, we will continue to track as the crew preparing for those welcome remarks now inside 10 minutes. This is Mission Control Houston, as we are now 5 minutes away from the formal welcoming remarks as the International Space Station has introduced, or will introduce, the members of Axiom Mission 4 formally after having docked to the International Space Station earlier this morning. They would dock to the orbital outpost at 5:31 a.m. Central. After pressurization and leak checks would occur on both sides for both the teams inside the Dragon Grace spacecraft and inside the International Space Station, the hatches would be open to welcome in the 4-person crew at 7:14 a.m. And we are now tracking for an 8:35 a.m. Central Time welcome remark, so a little bit more than a few more minutes away as the teams aboard the International Space Station currently settling in. It is the midway point of their day today after they were pressed into action early, as the arrival of Dragon would have them press right into their daily activations. For NASA astronaut Nicole Ayers and Anne McLean, they would oversee and monitor the progress of the Dragon spacecraft to the orbiting laboratory and execute those hatch opening ceremonies. Procedures, pardon me, and then, of course, all 11 members of Expedition 73 were there on the other side to welcome in Peggy Whitson, Shubanshu Shukla, Sławomir Uznanski-Wisniewski, and Tibor Kapu to the orbiting laboratory. And there you see the spacecraft, newly named Grace, docked to the International Space Station. And that is where they will reside for approximately the next 2 weeks, as they will participate in around 60 research investigations, numerous outreach activities, and more, representing 31 different countries, as the International Space Station has now welcomed its 4th private astronaut mission. It is their first since Axiom Mission 3 would arrive to the International Space Station, and that would be back in January of 2024. And just out of view, you can somewhat see the nose cone. If you look to the bottom left-hand side, just past where that Dragon spacecraft is, that is another Dragon spacecraft, Dragon Endurance, at the forward port of the International Space Station in the Harmony module, as both Grace and Endurance flying in front of the International Space Station, 2 of now 5 vehicles that are attached to the orbital outpost. Also Soyuz MS-27 that brought NASA astronaut Johnny Kim to the International Space Station, and 2 cargo craft, Roscosmos Progress cargo craft, also attached to the International Space Station. So a full house, both externally and internally, on the orbiting laboratory. We're approaching about 10 minutes until the welcome remarks for Peggy Whitson, Shubanshu Shukla, Sławomir Uznanski-Wisniewski, and Tibor Kapu. One of the traditions for the Axiom missions and the private astronaut missions is the pinning of the newly minted astronauts. For Peggy Whitson, she'll be placing those pins on Shubanshu Shukla, Sławomir Uznanski-Wisniewski, and Tibor Kapu. For them, this is their very first space flight and very first mission to low Earth orbit. After the welcome remarks, they will jump right into their activities, whether it is unloading the Dragon spacecraft or for the Expedition 73 crew back to their work schedules before settling in for the evening, and then hitting the ground running tomorrow. And for the Axiom Mission 4 team, that would be day 1 of their approximately 2-week mission aboard the International Space Station. And to take a look back at the activities for Axiom at Mission 4, they would lift off from Launch Complex 39A at NASA's Kennedy Space Center yesterday morning at 1:31 a.m. Central Time, carrying Whitson, Shukla, Uznanski-Wisniewski, and Kapu to low Earth orbit. And that is where, on the first time, Dragon spacecraft would announce the name of that spacecraft in Grace, and then proceed into their burns. They would execute a sequence of 5 major burns and a couple of adjustment burns to help raise Dragon's altitude and help close the gap between the spacecraft and the International Space Station, those being the phase, boost, close, transfer, and co-elliptic burns. And that Dragon spacecraft would continue to perform nominally and actually in its first flight swimmingly and all the way to the key waypoint markers and milestone markers, including the approach initiation burn, which would be executed earlier this morning. From there, they would go through 3 different checkpoints or gate processes, Waypoint 0, Waypoint 1, and Waypoint 2. But that Dragon spacecraft and its alignment with the International Space Station pretty well fine-tuned, only a brief pause at the Waypoint 2 mark after moving through Waypoint 0 and Waypoint 1. And while 20 meters away, they did a quick hold, saw that everything was A-OK, and continued to proceed with that soft capture and contact that would come at 5:31 a.m. Central Time. From there, Nicole Ayers and Ann McLean would begin the hatch opening procedures, while the team aboard the Dragon Grace spacecraft would also execute their arrival procedures. And shortly, about an hour and some change later at 7:14 a.m. Central, the hatch would be open. The pathway from the International Space Station and Dragon spacecraft would be opened up, and that is when Peggy Whitson, Shubanshu Shukla, Sławosz Uznansky-Wisniewski, and Tibor Kapu, and a wealth of smiles and glad handshakes and hugs will be passed around, as they have now upped the population of the International Space Station to 11 members. We continue to proceed towards the welcome remarks about 8 minutes from now, and we'll be sure to turn over all communications to the audio and video team as we will await the Expedition 73 crew and Axiom Mission 4. Of the 11 members, 6 nations now represented aboard the International Space Station of Hungary, Poland, India, the United States, Russia, and Japan.
Station Houston on Space Ground 2 for Johnny.
Yeah, I can take it.
Yep, yeah, just looking for someone to turn on the camera for the PAO event and do a quick 5 count just to make sure we're still good before we start.
Still good.
Okay, this Houston, this is station. I can give you 5 counts. 1.
Tak, we heard you, but just lost the video downlink, so please give us a minute. Talk, oh, there you go. Thanks, Shuk and Johnny, for checking the cables there. And Talk, if you could give us one more 5 count. We missed it on the last one because we lost video downlink.
Okay. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
That was a good scene and voice check, and we'll be ready to begin after the handover.
Great communications between the team on the ground and everyone on board the International Space Station, including the newly arrived Axiom Mission 4, as everyone getting staged and set up for the welcome remarks that'll get underway here in about 4 minutes' time. There will be an anticipated loss of signal, though briefly, and then we will bring everything back on board, and the welcome remarks in which Expedition 73 will welcome their 4 new friends aboard the orbiting laboratory, and we'll turn it over to the team from there. And again, we are experiencing a temporary loss of communications, but the acquisition of signal should be in just a couple of seconds. And once the video is on board, the welcome remarks for Axiom Mission 4 will get underway.
Station, this is Houston. Are you ready for the event?
Houston Station, we are ready for the event.
Please begin the welcome ceremony.
All right. Grace crew, welcome aboard the International Space Station. On behalf of Expedition 73 crew, I would like to make a couple of opening remarks. First of all, Peggy, welcome back.
Thank
you. It's a great honor and privilege to have such a legendary astronaut like you on board with us. And Tibor, Shuks, and Suave, congratulations on your first space flight. And we've been waiting for you guys so long, and we are so happy to see your all smiling faces. And with your arrival, right now there are 11 astronauts from 6 countries, and all of us are here in order to advance human space exploration and scientific research, symbolizing international cooperation. So from this moment, you are also a part of Expedition 73. And once again, welcome aboard. And I will pass the microphone to Axiom for Commander Peggy Whitson.
Thank you so much, Tak, and for the 73 crew as well. We appreciate being invited in. You guys are exceptional hosts, and hopefully you'll think we're exceptional guests at the end of a couple of weeks. But we're looking forward to getting a lot of work done with you guys, and I really appreciate all the support you've provided to us in advance of actually even getting here. I think that's very unique and special about you. And the best part about being a commander on a mission with all rookies is you get to watch the rookies go through it for the first time. And it helps you remember some of the things you went through the first time. But it also, it's just very special to get to relive the experience again through these guys. And so I'd like to give these guys their astronaut pins. So we'll start with Shubanshu Shukla, astronaut number 634. Wow. Yeah, I'll go ahead and get these out.
Thank you, Peggy. Oh, so I am number 634. That's a privilege. No, but to be fair, it is a privilege to be amongst the few who have got the chance to see the Earth from a vantage point that I have been able to see now. It has been a wonderful ride. It has been great, and I was looking forward to come to space. It is something to look forward to as such. But the minute I entered the International Space Station and you guys, this crew, you just made me feel so welcome, as if you literally opened your doors, like your house doors for us. That's true. So, but it was fantastic. I feel even better. Whatever expectation I had of